Avoidants don't wake up in the beginning thinking, I'm hurting this person. They move through the relationship inside a story that makes their behavior feel reasonable, even necessary. And the painful truth is that your forgiveness and continued presence help support that story, not because you're weak, but because you love deeply. And that love becomes the cushion that absorbs the impact of what they're doing. Every time they pulled away, went cold, shut down, or dismissed your feelings, there was a moment where they could have registered, this is damaging, this is too much, I might lose them. But instead of hitting that wall, they ran into your softness, your understanding, your, I get it, you've been through a lot. And that turned what should have been a warning into a comfort. They didn't have to feel the full weight of their actions, because you were always there to pad the landing, to explain their behavior to yourself, to rationalize it to your friends, to reassure them that you weren't going anywhere. When they ignored your message for days and then popped back in with a casual, hey, and you responded with warmth instead of a boundary, the lesson their nervous system quietly learned was, I didn't break anything. They're fine. This isn't that serious. When they dismissed your tears as overreactions and you later apologized for being emotional, they internalized, my behavior isn't the problem, their reaction is. When they pulled the I just need space card and you sat there twisting your heart into knots trying to be low maintenance, they absorbed the message, I can choose distance without real risk. They'll accommodate me. You meant to show grace, loyalty, commitment. You wanted to prove that you wouldn't abandon them like others did, that you could hold space for their wounds. But over time, your staying, even when you were shattered inside, became part of the evidence. Their mind used to argue that they weren't really causing damage, because if they were, surely you would leave. Surely you would cut them off. Surely you wouldn't keep answering at 2 a.m. and showing up to every emotional fire they started. So your presence became their subconscious permission slip, not because you said, do whatever you want, but because you kept enduring whatever they wanted and calling it love. It is excruciating to admit this, because it sounds like blaming yourself for their behavior, but it isn't. Their avoidance, their dismissiveness, their inability to show up is on them, full stop. The part that involves you is this. Your heart kept protecting them from fully seeing the consequences of their actions. You stood between them and the mirror, absorbing the impact they should have felt, turning their sharp edges into stories about trauma and fear. And because you stayed, they could keep living in the fantasy that their way of loving was just who they are, not something that was cutting into you every day. Avoidants often survive by narrowing their emotional field. They focus on how overwhelmed or trapped they feel, how scared they are of intimacy, how pressured they feel by your needs. And because your love kept showing up anyway, they didn't have to widen that field to include the reality of your suffering. They didn't have to fully notice how your eyes grew duller over time, how your voice shook when you asked simple questions, how your texts shifted from excited to cautious, how your body eventually went into a permanent flinch around them. They glossed over those signs because your next act of forgiveness smoothed the surface again. One heartfelt apology from you, one more attempt to understand them, and everything looked okay on the outside. It didn't realize the damage, not because it wasn't there, but because the person being damaged was the same person constantly patching things up. You cried and then wiped your own tears. You said, this is killing me, and then reassured them you'd be fine. You talked about needing more and then accepted less. You made it too easy for them to believe you were strong enough to handle their inconsistencies, and that allowed them to keep underestimating the cost of their behavior. They thought you were bendable, not breakable. They thought your heart could be stretched forever, without tearing. Only when you stop cushioning, stop excusing, stop returning, only when your actions finally match your words and you step out, does the true outline of the damage come into focus for them. And that is why, at first, they genuinely don't realize how deep it goes. Your forgiveness and your presence were the very things that protected them from seeing the wounds they were causing, until the day you couldn't protect them from that truth anymore, because you chose, finally, to protect yourself. The day they wake up to the damage they caused is almost never the day you send the perfect message, pour your heart out one more time, or craft a final speech that explains everything with surgical precision. It usually doesn't happen in the heat of an argument or in the middle of your tears. It happens quietly, in rooms you're not in moments where your name is not even spoken, in the kind of silence that you once begged them to sit in with you, and they refused. And that's the cruel and freeing irony of it all. The awakening you tried to drag out of them with your explanations, your reasoning, your emotional x-rays of the relationship doesn't come because of another attempt from you. It comes because life finally corners them in a way they can't avoid. Sometimes it's loneliness, a night where the noise runs out, and the phone stays still, and there is no one checking on them just because. No one asking how they slept. No one remembering the small details they shared at 2 a.m. They feel a hollow ache, and for the first time, they can't fix it by pulling you in, because you're not there anymore. Or if you are, you're no longer giving them the emotional access they were once entitled to. And in that vacuum, they start to replay memories they used to fast forward through. They remember your face when you said, "I'm not okay," and they brushed it off. They remember how your messages shifted from long and open to short and guarded. They remember how they told themselves you were too much, just so they didn't have to admit they were giving too little. And all of that lands differently when there isn't a new text from you coming in to cushion the blow. Sometimes the trigger is therapy, or a conversation with a friend who doesn't let them hide, or a podcast, a book, a video that names the very pattern they've been living in: avoidant, dismissive, emotionally unavailable. And as they listen, they hear themselves, not in the victim role they usually adopt, but in the one causing the same confusion and anxiety they've always blamed on others. They hear someone describe how it feels to be on the other side of hot and cold love, and suddenly your words, the ones they once dismissed as dramatic, echo in their mind with a painful clarity. They feel a sting of recognition they can't shake off with, "You're just sensitive," anymore. And then there's the trigger that no one wants to admit holds the most power: your lasting absence. Not a temporary sulk, not a 3-day silent treatment followed by a flood of reconciliation energy, but the kind of absence that stretches into weeks and months, where you are no longer orbiting them emotionally, no longer liking their posts out of habit, no longer sending birthday paragraphs, no longer reaching out when something reminds you of them. That absence is not loud. It doesn't slam doors, but it rearranges something in their internal landscape, because for the first time they are forced to sit with a version of reality in which you are not guaranteed, where your love is not a permanent safety net they can fall back into when everything else feels empty. And that unsettles them in a way your words never could. The reason your messages and speeches never achieved what this quiet does is not because you weren't clear. It's because they had an escape route then. They could tune you out, shut down, label you as overreacting, wait for the storm of your feelings to pass, and then slide back into old patterns. But they cannot tune out the consistent hum of their own loneliness. They cannot ghost their own guilt. They cannot block the way their body reacts when they remember the softness in you that is no longer available. They cannot outrun the image of how your eyes looked the last time you begged them to see what this was doing to you. Life becomes the mirror you tried to be. Loneliness becomes the consequence you tried to describe. Your absence becomes the teacher you tried to play. And slowly, without fanfare, it begins to dawn on them that the damage wasn't theoretical. It wasn't just you being emotional. It was real. And they are only seeing it now because the one person who used to protect them from that reality, by staying and explaining and absorbing, finally stepped back. That is why their awakening is so often delayed and so often private, not because your efforts failed, but because the truth needed the one thing their avoidance cannot tolerate: uninterrupted silence and a world where you are no longer fixing what they keep breaking. In their awakening, One of the most painful truths that finally hits them is the pattern they never wanted to see while it was happening. The pattern where you were bending, explaining, and fighting for the bond, while they were withdrawing, minimizing, and escaping. Because for a long time they lived inside their version of events where they were overwhelmed and you were too much. They told themselves they were just trying to protect their peace, their independence, their space, and they reassured themselves with the idea that you were simply more emotional, more intense, more demanding. But when life finally slows them down, and they look honestly at what actually happened between you, they start seeing the timeline in brutal clarity. And in that timeline, they are no longer the calm, rational one, and you are no longer the unstable, needy one. They see instead a completely different picture. One where you kept walking toward them with open hands, honest words, and trembling courage, while they kept stepping back, shutting down, and emotionally hiding in the shadows. They remember the countless times you tried to talk, really talk, not to attack them, but to understand, to repair, to build something stronger. And how those conversations usually ended with them saying, "You're overthinking," or "Why are you making a big deal out of this?" They see now that while you were bringing your vulnerable underbelly to the table, they were minimizing your experience so they didn't have to feel responsible for it. You'd come with specific examples of how their distance made you feel unsafe. They'd brush it off with, "That's just how I am," or "You know I'm bad at communication." And instead of stepping up, they hid behind those statements like shields. In their awakening, those moments replay with a different emotional color. What once felt like self-protection now looks a lot like self-absorption. What once felt like keeping things light now looks like refusing to meet you in the depth where relationships are actually built. They start to see how much you bent, not just once, but repeatedly. You bent your standards, telling yourself you were being flexible. You bent your boundaries, convincing yourself you were being understanding. You bent your voice, learning how to say things more softly, less often, in ways that wouldn't trigger them. You bent your needs, shrinking them down, editing them, feeding them to the relationship in tiny pieces so they wouldn't feel overwhelmed. And every time you did this, you were trying to keep the connection alive. You thought, if I just present it right, if I'm patient enough, if I don't push too hard, they'll meet me here. And in their awakening, they have to face the horrifying reality that you didn't bend because you were unstable. You bent because you were trying to hold both of you on your shoulders while they refused to pick up their half. In contrast, they see their own pattern clearly for the first time, withdrawing when things got real, disappearing when tension rose, going numb when you cried, changing the subject when you asked, "What are we?" They see how often they chose escape over engagement, not because the relationship was toxic, but because intimacy made them feel out of control. Instead of saying, "I'm scared," they went silent. Instead of saying, "I don't know how to handle this," they said, "You're too intense." Instead of saying, "I feel guilty," they rolled their eyes, shut down, or shut you out. The pattern becomes painfully obvious. You felt a rupture and moved toward repair. They felt a rupture and moved toward retreat. You fought for the bond. They fought for their distance. What really starts to haunt them is the contrast between your effort and their response. They remember you sending long messages, trying to explain your heart, your triggers, your attachment. And they remember themselves skimming, replying with a one-line answer or a half-hearted, "Yeah, I get it," without actually changing anything. They remember you asking, "Can we talk? This matters to me." And the way they sighed, rolled their eyes, or acted like you were ruining their night. They remember you staying up late, wired with anxiety, trying to find a way to express yourself that wouldn't scare them, while they fell asleep telling themselves you would calm down eventually. In the mirror of memory, that difference between your emotional labor and their emotional avoidance can no longer be spun as you being too much. It becomes undeniable evidence that you were the only one consistently fighting for the relationship to be deeper, safer, and more honest. They also see how their minimizing wasn't neutral. Every time they downplayed your pain, they weren't just disagreeing. They were cutting into your reality, teaching you to doubt your own perception. Every time they said, "It's not that deep," when you were shaking from anxiety, or "You're making something out of nothing," when you were trying to name a pattern, they were essentially saying, "My comfort matters more than your truth." And your nervous system absorbed that message. You started to question yourself, to wonder if you were indeed too sensitive, too needy, too dramatic. And you shrank accordingly, thinking that would make you more lovable. In their awakening, they finally see this not as you being unstable, but as you being slowly worn down by a dynamic where your reality was constantly minimized so they didn't have to feel uncomfortable. The pattern of you fighting and them escaping becomes a storyline they can't unsee. And with that comes the weight of understanding that the relationship was never balanced. Not emotionally, not energetically. You were living in two different jobs. One of you was trying to build something, the other was trying to survive something. And the hardest part, the part that stings their conscience, is realizing that they benefited from your fight the whole time, your willingness to keep coming back, to keep opening up, to keep explaining, allowed them to feel wanted without ever having to fully show up as a partner. When they finally wake up to this, the damage is not just about what they did, but about what they didn't do. All the times they could have met you halfway and chose instead to watch you carry the weight alone. Your absence doesn't just mean you're not texting or calling anymore. It rips the veil off the entire dynamic and shows them, often for the very first time, just how much of the relationship's stability was being carried by your emotional labor. And when that labor disappears, the space they always romanticized as freedom suddenly feels like pure, unfiltered emptiness. While you were there, even in the most painful phases, they could afford to tell themselves that their distance was harmless. They could label it as needing time, being overwhelmed, not wanting drama, because no matter how far they pulled back, you were still doing the invisible work that kept the connection alive. You were the one initiating difficult conversations. You were the one checking in when they went quiet. You were the one bringing up misunderstandings and trying to clear them. You were the one soothing the tension after arguments. You were the one saying, "Can we talk?" when they pretended nothing was wrong. You were the emotional engine of the relationship, constantly turning over, powering forward, even when they were sitting in the passenger seat with their arms folded, insisting they didn't ask for all this. That is why their space felt comfortable too, because it was never true emptiness. It was distance cushioned by your ongoing, quiet devotion. Even when you felt like you were falling apart, you would still send a, "Did you get home safe?" Still remember their big day, still show up with care when they were stressed, still be emotionally available for their needs while they hid from yours. And that steady flow of energy coming from you is what made them feel like the relationship was safe enough, manageable enough, worth staying in, even though they weren't really investing at the same depth. When you finally step away, when you stop managing every emotional loose end, when you stop sending the first message, when you stop being the bridge every time there's a crack, they are left with the bare bones of what they actually put in. And often, it is shockingly little. And this is where their experience of space changes completely, because now, instead of feeling relaxed by distance, they feel the hollowness of a connection that doesn't move if you don't move it. They wake up, and there is no good morning text softening the start of their day. They have a rough moment and realize the person who used to check in on them without being asked isn't there. They scroll through their notifications and notice that the only deep, nourishing conversations they've had in weeks are with you. And now those threads are still. They look back over old chats and see a pattern they were blind to before. Your long messages versus their short replies. Your constant efforts to clarify versus their "it's fine." your attempts to repair versus their avoidance. And for the first time, without your new message sliding in to continue the thread, the imbalance becomes undeniable. The silence exposes the truth. It shows them that what they called keeping things chill was actually you constantly regulating the emotional climate. That what they labeled as, "I don't do drama," was really them refusing to engage while you did all the cleaning up. That what they framed as, "I just need a lot of space," was actually a relationship surviving on one person's willingness to reach across the distance again and again. Your absence takes away their favorite anesthesia, your effort. And once that's gone, the emptiness of their own contribution echoes. They sit in their apartment, scrolling, and feel a kind of quiet that doesn't feel like peace. It feels like something is missing. Not just you as a person, but the way your presence made their inner world feel less lonely, less chaotic, less disconnected. And they realize that their comfort around space only ever existed because there was always a you on the other side of it, tending to the bond, holding the invisible thread between you, refusing to let it snap, even when it cut into your own hands. Without that, space stops being a sanctuary and becomes a mirror. It shows them their emotional laziness, their habit of letting you drive every repair, their tendency to disappear instead of communicate. And when there is no new proof of your love arriving in their phone, they can no longer tell themselves, "It's fine, they know how I feel." The hard truth lands. You were the stability, not the dynamic itself. The relationship didn't just work. You made it work, with your apologies, your understanding, your late-night overthinking, your willingness to keep choosing them on days they barely chose you. And as that awareness sinks in, what they once called needing space starts to feel like the very thing that cost them the only person who ever tried that hard to hold both of you. Because now space isn't padded by your love. It is edged with the realization that the cushion was never theirs. It was always you. By the time they fully understand the damage they caused, you are often already somewhere else emotionally, somewhere they never imagined you'd get to. Because while they were avoiding their feelings, you were drowning in yours, and you had no choice but to learn how to swim. You had to learn how to live without the constant confusion, without the constant hope that one day they'll get it. So you started your healing journey long before their awakening ever arrived. You began it on the nights you cried yourself to sleep and then got up the next day and chose not to text. You began it the moment you stopped explaining the same thing for the 10th time, the moment you sat on your hands instead of sending that long message, the moment you looked at your reflection and whispered, "I can't keep doing this to myself," and meant it, even if you didn't know what the next step was. While they were numbing, distracting, rationalizing, you were feeling every sting, every rejection, every dismissal in full color. And because you felt it, you eventually had to do something with that pain. You couldn't just leave it sitting inside you. You started reading, listening, journaling, praying, talking to friends who actually saw you, talking to yourself in kinder ways, connecting dots between your childhood wounds and the type of love you kept accepting. And slowly, without fanfare, your nervous system began to uncurl from around them. They were still in your mind, still in your heart, but no longer in the position of God, no longer the center of your survival. As they go through their late awakening, realizing how deep they cut you, remembering the moments they brushed off your tears, minimized your needs, disappeared when you begged for reassurance, they are shocked not only by the impact, but by how different you are now. They expect to find you where they left you, emotionally waiting, door half open, heart still on call. And instead, they find someone whose energy has shifted, someone who no longer chases, no longer over-explains, no longer sacrifices themselves at the altar of potential. You can still feel the echo of what you shared, but you are not living off it anymore. You've built new rituals, new circles, new dreams. You've remembered how to laugh without waiting for their reply, how to breathe without scanning for their mood, how to feel beautiful without needing their validation. And that gap in timing is brutal for them to face, because they are just now starting to feel the weight of what they did. At the exact moment, you are finally feeling the lightness of having stepped away. They reread old messages and flinch. They wish they had listened when you said, "This is breaking me." They wish they had taken your last warning seriously instead of assuming you'd never really go. They wish they could go back to that one conversation and choose differently. And for the first time, those wishes burn. But the versions of you that begged, the version that kept apologizing for being too much, the version that tolerated bare minimum effort while calling it love, that version is not fully alive anymore. You outgrew that skin out of survival, and healing has made it impossible to willingly squeeze yourself back into it, even if a part of you still cares about them. There is a quiet power in the way you interact now, or choose not to interact at all. Your responses, if there are any, are shorter, cleaner, less emotionally loaded. You no longer argue to prove your reality. You no longer chase their understanding. You don't send 3 follow-ups if they don't answer. You might simply say, "I hear you. I appreciate you saying that." Or nothing at all, and move on with your day. Not out of spite, but because your life is finally bigger than the drama of this one connection. It confuses and hurts them to realize that the person they took for granted as always there is not available in the same way anymore, that the fire they could always warm their hands over has turned into steady embers that no longer leap up on command, that their apologies, though genuine, are arriving after the version of you that needed them most has already done the work of forgiving for your own sanity. This is the heartbreaking truth about healing and awakening. It rarely happens at the same time for both people. You woke up in the middle of the relationship and saw the damage clearly while they were still asleep inside their defenses. You started cleaning up the wreckage in your own heart while they were still pretending nothing was really broken. So when they finally opened their eyes, wide and stunned, you are not standing in the ruins with them. You are further down the road, stronger, clearer, more protective of your peace, and they have to face the reality that their late understanding doesn't entitle them to early access to you. They are arriving at a door they once kept you begging at, only to find that you no longer live there in the same way. You might still care, you might still feel a tug, but your loyalty has shifted direction. It now belongs to the you who barely survived. That story, and no amount of their belated clarity can undo the fact that your healing started the moment you decided your life could not revolve around someone who only learns the value of your heart after they've already broken it.